Hello, Browse. We're back with the mother in history. Marguerite Oswald, the mother of the man who killed Kennedy by Jean Stafford. And we pick up on page 18 as I try not to injure the spine here. The question was rhetorical and was put to the audience out there beyond the footlights, but I countered it with another. Do you have any idea? I don't have an idea, I know, she said. And of course, when I find out who framed my son, then we can find out who killed Kennedy. I go a little different way than most of the books on who killed Kennedy. My theory is a little different. Because I know who framed my son, and he knows I know who framed my son. Is he in Texas now? I can divulge nothing on that score, she said brusquely, but screwed up her eyes in a cordial grimace to show that she forgave my intrusion into something that was none of my beeswax. I backed out of this dead end and returned to the avenue of the past I had tried to guide her down before. I asked what Lee Harvey's hobbies had been as a child. He had a stamp collection, she said with a practiced smile, and he loved to play Monopoly, which is a thinking game. So was stamps. He had a stamp collection. He loved to play chess. He was a very good chess player and anything like that. So he was really a very busy little boy, and I don't see anything abnormal about any part of his life. He'd climb up on the roof to look at the stars, and I'd have to get the older boys to get him down because he was interested in astronomy. Now I'm talking about a boy 8, 9, 10 years old, and he just loved to read very deep books. He liked Darwin, Hemingway, Norman Vincent Peale. When he went to visit my sister, all she said she saw him read was comic books. And this is what she said to the Warren Commission. Well, that was true, and he did like comic books. Isn't that normal in a young boy? He loved to read about animals. He knew all about animals. You know, they said he played hooky in New York. And he did. And then, of course, we had to go to the board several times because he was always picked up in the Bronx Zoo. We only lived about 2 blocks from there, and this is where they would always find him because he loved animals. Someone said, well, at least it was educational. I have to smile a little bit because boys do play hooky. I didn't say it's the right thing to do, and I don't say children should do it, but I certainly don't think it's abnormal. Lee came home one day when we were in New York just about a week or so, and it was exactly the time he was supposed to get home from school, and I had given him enough lunch money and always gave a few extra nickels, in case they needed something or got lost on the subway. Now, I have never been in the subway. We had been in New York just about 1 week, and I had driven to New York with Lee. So he said, Mother, I didn't go to school today. I said, You didn't? Where did you go? Oh, he said, I rode all around. I rode all day on the subway. I rode to Brooklyn. I went to Queens, blah, blah, blah. Well, I'm smiling to myself because there again, from Texas, if you go a few miles, you pay 25 cents for bus fare. And if you go a few miles further, you have to pay extra. So I think he's pulling my leg. I'm going along with him, not saying a thing. So that afternoon, we're having supper, and I said to his brother, John Edward, what do you think? Lee didn't go to school today. He made the subway all day long, and of course, they're grinning because I'm the fool and don't know it, see? And this went on, and finally John Edward said, Mother, he's telling the truth. He can ride the subway all day for the same amount of money. Well, I didn't know that, but the point is, Lee was telling me he didn't go to school. Now, I want to say this in defense of my son. Let's have some defense of Lee Harvey Oswald and his mother. How many boys at age 13 that play hooky from school would come home from school and tell his mother that he did so? Well, of course, he played hooky after that, and they cautioned me, and they cautioned me. And finally, they brought us into court, and Lee was taken from me. And he was placed in a children's home. I think he was in the home 5 or 6 weeks, and that was Warwick. I think that was the name of it. I'd have to check in the Warren report in Brooklyn. After the assassination, all this came out, and that Lee needed psychiatric treatment and so on and so forth, and that I refused, and that, well, this was a clue to the assassination. I Would have to read you the Warren Commission report on Lee's psychiatric treatment and tear it apart. Lies. I was never told my son needed psychiatric treatment, believe me. And this man, I forget his name, I stepped on his toes, and sometimes I wonder, did he hold it against me enough to harm my son? By the way, do you know that he is Mayor Wagner's right-handed man? How do you suppose he got from probation officer to an official capacity in New York State? This time she really seemed to want an answer, but since I did not know who Mayor Wagner's right-handed man was, didn't know who his southpaw was either, let alone what his credentials were, I had to let her down. In view of the mass of detail she had at her command and the dexterous use she made of it to fit her argument, I felt like a flop on a junior high debating team who hadn't the prayer of reaching the semifinals. I find those things very, very interesting, she said, because as I'm researching Lee's life, and I'm not the only one, it looks as though this boy's life has been supervised. But if I stress this, they say, this woman is out of her mind. Let's put her in a mental institution. Isn't it silly? She chuckled at the preposterous way of the world, sipped coffee, and changing from her official to her chatty voice said, Lee purely loved animals. With his very first pay, he bought a bird in a cage. And I have a picture of it. He bought this bird with a cage that had a planter for ivy. And he took care of that bird, and he made the ivy grow. Now, you see, there could be many nice things written about this boy, but oh no. No, this boy is supposed to be the assassin of a president of the United States. So he has to be a louse. Sometimes I am very sad. I started to mouth some safe platitude of sympathy, but I got no further than an introductory mutter. She went right on. When I think of all the things Lee did, her tranquility was ruffled, and her voice went up a note or two. It was the voice of a woman in altercation with a butcher who had overcharged her, or with someone who had jostled her in a bus. How can you call him a loner or an introvert or whatever they wanted to call him? Of course, after they arrested him, they had to find an environmental factor. And right away, they said we moved around a lot. Well, all right, what if we did? We weren't drifters. This is the 20th century, and people move around. That's educational, isn't it? No matter where we were, we always had a decent home. I wouldn't put up with a piece of torn upholstery or something broken or anything like that. I'd go for the five and dime and get something and fix it up. You see how I live? Nothing fancy, but a bright touch, a little decorator piece here and there. She waved both hands, gesturing towards the appointments of the room and bestowing her good wishes on them. And I never neglected my children. Oh, yes, we didn't have steak, but we never even thought about steak. I didn't anyway. I was always grateful to eat, and the children never really and truly complained. I know of one or two occasions when the boy said, Mother, why don't you have a platter of chops? I was at such and such a house yesterday, and they served seconds, and I said, well, now, honey, this is all Mother can do. If, say, 3 days before payday I had $1.50 to my name, I would cook up a big pot of beans and cornbread or a big pot of spaghetti and meatballs and make it last. But I happen to know some women in that position who would take that $1.50 and go to the corner restaurant and come home with hamburgers and Coke. And there's your difference. I have always done what I thought was right, and I always did it in a true Christian way. And even though we were poor and I was a widow and I did have to support myself and these and 3 children, I always seemed to manage. I have often been complimented about how I look when I'm dressed up, about my little home, and about the way the children act, and so forth, and so on and so forth. Now I'm patting myself on the back as a mother, only so that the people will understand. Why am I so concerned that the people will understand? It is natural because I am a mother in history. I am in 26 volumes of the Warren Report, which is all over the world, so I must defend myself and defend my son Lee. She altered the position of a green glass ashtray in the shape of a swan. Then, as if she had given the matter sober thought, and this was her considered opinion, she said, I would say that the Oswald family was actually an average American family. What the components were that made up Mrs. Oswald's image of an average American family, I never learned. I asked, but the answer was apparently self-evident, and she ignored me. Since I do not know either how the sociologists and statisticians arrive at this denomination, it is quite possible that she and her brood fitted into it. But Certain eccentricities of their circumstance had struck me when I had read the acres of newsprint following the assassination, and I doubted that the word average was precise or even approximate. To begin with, the record of Mrs. Oswald's matrimonial misfortune shoots off at a 45-degree angle from the norm. She was abandoned by her first husband, Edward John Pye. What's that? Pick. When her child by him, John Edward, was an infant. She was widowed by Robert Lee Oswald when her first son by him was a child, and Lee Harvey was not yet born. Her third marriage to a Mr. Ekdahl was a hurricane, and while the lull before it was lengthy, I made him wait a year, and the restoration period afterward was long. The storm itself, which raised the roof under which they dwelt together, was brief. The household, therefore, was only sporadically manned by a man. The Oswald economy was far from stable. Under the terms of the first divorce, Mrs. Pick was required to contribute to the support of his son, and Mr. Oswald had insured his life for a nominal sum. But these were humble funds, and Mrs. Oswald, pressed and proud and energetic, went to work. The boys, in the absence of a full-time caretaker, were sent variously to schools and to church-sponsored children's homes. Lee Harvey joined his older brother in a Lutheran orphanage when he was 3. Sometimes they were at home, with their mother, and when they were old enough, they got jobs to pay for their board and keep. Robert Oswald, at 16, had a job as a shoe stock boy at Everybody's department store. The family moved with dizzying frequency while they lived in New Orleans, and later on when they lived in and around Fort Worth. Sometimes they rented apartments, and sometimes they owned houses. They appear very often to have lived in two-family dwellings when she was unencumbered. Mrs. Oswald stayed in lodgings. In both cities, their addresses were in similar neighborhoods, and John Edward Pick and Robert Lee Oswald, in their testimony before the Warren Commission, had trouble remembering the names of the streets where they had lived. When I asked Mrs. Oswald where John Edward Pick had lived in New York at the time, she said she and Lee Harvey stayed with him there for a short and troubled interval. She said she did not know that he and his wife were somewhere on the east side, giving me a choice ranging from Delancey Street to Spanish Harlem, with Sutton Place and Gracie Square in between. She was an urban product, the kind of person who knows her own neighborhood thoroughly, may know 2 or 3 neighborhoods thoroughly, but who has no sense of a city as a whole. The ambience of New York did not differ from that of New Orleans, nor did New Orleans differ from Fort Worth. Footnote 2, see Appendix 2. Even as she sat in her own parlor with only me to stimulate her, she emanated restlessness. She fairly skipped as she was sitting down. She had handed down her energy and wanderlust to her sons, all of whom joined the Marines as early as they could. We are a military family, she said. However, at the same time, nomadic as she was, her nest-building instinct was steadfast. But it was the instinct of a migratory species that, insofar as possible, duplicates its successive nests, twigs, and leaves from the same sorts of trees, and swatches of the same kinds of moss and lichen. Nothing in the room appeared to have more than the most ephemeral association of time or place. Whenever, in the course of my interviews, I asked where she had got a vase or a bowl or a tray, she said, "Oh, that's just a little decorator thing I picked up to go with the other colors." Her sons, under her guidance, were upright. They didn't cuss. Of course, I don't say they didn't on the outside, but they didn't in front of me. We, none of us, used obscene language. Oh, I might say damn, sometime, but none of the boys. And one thing I did with them, but they never did know until later on in life, I never let them have a key to the front door. I remember Robert asking me, and I said, "Oh, no, honey, it's better you wake me up, because if I ever heard the front door, I would think it was a burglar or something." But this wasn't the idea. I wanted to be sure that no boy of mine would come into my home drunk. And I can truthfully say not a one of them ever entered my home stinko. They probably had a beer on the outside, for I'm not saying they're perfect. Now, I have no objection to social drinking, and I've been to cocktail parties myself. But I don't drink because alcohol doesn't agree with me at all. But I would if I wanted to. And another thing, I never let my boys have my car because I thought they were too young to use it. And as it was my livelihood, I was, as I was an insurance lady, I couldn't afford to let a teenager wreck it. The teenagers, as we say, I think they're a wonderful bunch, but they were going a little wild, had their own cars, and so on and so forth. So I never let my boys have my car, and I can truthfully say none of my boys ever came into my home drunk. I think this is a very nice thing to say, a woman raising children by herself, particularly boys. I'm going to give myself credit for this, and I think I deserve it. The room was still cool, but the air was heavy, imbued with the secondhand mustiness of air conditioning and the smoke from my cigarettes. I was tired and headachy, but Mrs. Oswald was as fresh and kinetic as she had been when she greeted me, and she persevered like a long distance runner. You know, there was a violent campaign against me as well as my son in magazines, newspapers, and written literature. Most all the papers pictured me in a sort of a bad light, but really I'm not that way at all, and never was. I should say I'm very outspoken. I'm aggressive. I'm no dope. Let's face it, if you step on my toes, I'm gonna fight back. And I don't apologize for that. This was my training along with Lee's father who, as we all know, is now deceased. Although I should have been used to it by now, I was surprised each time she used the royal or tutorial we, and only the most tenuous hold on reality kept me from glancing from left to right to see who besides me was attending the lecture. When my older boy first went to school, he came home one day crying that the children had taken his pennies away from him. Mr. Oswald took his little hand and started teaching him how to fight back. And I listened and I thought it was a wonderful thing. I remember him saying, if you ever start a fight, you're going to be whipped. But if they ever start a fight with you and you don't fight back, I'm going to whip you. Let me give you one instance with Lee and the next door neighbor boy. They were approximately the same age, and if not, they were the same height, and Lee had a dog. He loved his shepherd collie dog. It was named Sunshine. He used to romp in the backyard with his dog and took him every place he went. And this little boy was throwing rocks over the fence at Lee's dog. Well, my kitchen window had a view to the backyard, and I watched my son Lee for approximately 3 days telling the boy over the fence he better stop throwing rocks at his dog. Well, I was amused and I was just waiting to find out what happened. Finally, one day when I came home from work, the father called me on the phone. It seemed his son was very badly beaten up in a child's way. My son Lee had finally taken upon himself, after much patience, I thought, to confront the little boy enough to fight him, and the father didn't approve. I told the father what happened, and since the boys were approximately the same age and height, let them fight their own battles. Now, my boys were never tied to my apron strings, and Lee wanted to know all there was about life, talking about going to Russia. He never did tell me why he went to Russia. I have my own opinion. He spoke Russian, he wrote Russian, and he read Russian. Why? Because my boy was being trained as an agent. That's why. Another thing I found out in some book where it said he was placed in another hut because he couldn't get along with someone. He was placed with a Cuban, and he was learning Spanish. I think he was spying on that Cuban. It's just so obvious. How many Marines are going around reading Russian and getting Russian newspapers? 1 and 1 makes 2 to me. That boy was being trained. I asked her what she thought Lee would have done with his life if he had not been killed, and she answered at once as if she had answered the question many times before. From what I know of my boy, and of course you have to understand that actually the last time I was very close to Lee was before he joined the service in 1956. After that, it was just through correspondence and then on his leaves home from the Marines that I knew him. But every time he came home, he talked and talked about the Marines and nothing else. I know when he came back from Japan, he said, "Oh, what a wonderful experience. What a wonderful trip." He said, "Did you know it cost my government over $2,000 to send me there? I could never afford it on my own." I think he was doing with his life what he wanted to do. And I'm going to say he was working for his country as an agent. I think that at age 16, he became involved. That at age 16, I think that at age 16 he became involved, that at age 16 Lee Harvey Oswald was being trained as a government agent. And this brings up Russia and, of course, Marina. I was glad she had broached the subject of her daughter-in-law. I had been shy of doing so myself because I knew that there was bad blood between the two women. "Let's have some more coffee before I go into that," she said. "We'll need it." She went once again to the kitchen where, with her back to me as she went about the business of the coffee, she honed her scalpels for the vivisection of Marina. Of course, I don't know too much about Marina. She lived with me the 1 month when they came back from Russia. She was a very humble foreign girl, and she never smoked in front of me. Everything was mama and the baby, and we got along fine. Now, this person never smoked in front of me for a reason, because she did smoke, and she smoked in Russia. The testimony of the presidential report showed that she knew Americans before she knew Lee, and they taught her how to smoke. Now, I smoked for 20 years, and Lee never did say a word to me about smoking. Maybe he had respect because I was a mother, but he objected to his wife smoking, and she evidently thought I never smoked because she never smoked in front of me. I don't know Marina smoked until the assassination. At the moment, like a white rat in some unprecedented experiment, I had a lighted cigarette in my hand, and another was burning in the ashtray. And you see, I wouldn't be that type. I would be natural and do what I have to do. And there, again, we get into she's not a true person. If I smoke in front of everybody. Of course, I would ask permission of an older person. There was a moment's silence, and I tried to remember if I had minded my manners at the beginning and asked if I could smoke. I thought I had, but at this point I could be sure of nothing except that I was a white rat. "To me, Marina is not a true person," she said with fair-minded deliberation. "This is hard to explain. I have to ask myself who Marina Oswald really is. I'd like to see her marriage certificate sometime, and I'd like to know more about her. Oh, when Marina went to Washington, Washington fell in love with Marina Oswald, and Chief Justice Warren was her grandfather. But when I went to Washington, don't listen to her. Mama hadn't seen Lee in a year, and she doesn't know anything, blah, blah, blah. Everything was against me, yet I was the mother. Now, I don't say that Marina is necessarily guilty of anything, but both she and Mrs. Payne have lied continuously. Maybe they are not guilty, but why is it necessary to lie? When it first happened, Marina did not identify the rifle. She said, yes, Lee had a rifle, but when they showed it to her, she said she couldn't say whether that was his. Now, this is understandable. If your husband had a rifle, and particularly if he had it, as they say he had it, wrapped up in a blanket and never using it, would the wife be able to identify it? Yet a few weeks later, when she had taken oath and been brainwashed by the Secret Service, she identified the rifle as Lee's. And at first she said, Lee, good man. Lee no shoot anybody. And then she changed her testimony. Marina seems French to me. French? Yes, sweetheart, that's what I said. Marina Oswald would seem French to me. Seems French to me. Oh, definitely. She came back with our coffee, and as she put it down beside me, she said, but that will have to be continued in our next. You'll have to drink up, honey. Your driver's here. I had not heard a car, and shrubbery obscured the window that looked into the street. But when I peered through the interstices of the privet, I saw that she was indeed right, and the car to take me back to Dallas, where I was staying, was at the curb. I began to respect the sixth sense she had several times laid claim to. I have a very unusual extrasensory perception, she had said once, so doesn't it stand to reason that if my boy shot the president, I would have known at the time it happened? I respected also her dramatic sense of timing, and I wondered how I would hang to the cliff until I heard about Marina's French origins. As I got up to go, I asked if she would object to my bringing a tape recorder the following day. She said that, on the contrary, she would be glad if I did, if, that is, I brought two machines, since she wanted one tape to preserve for history. She had made many recordings, she told me, for mass mediums and for her own purposes. She knew that she spoke at the rate of 180 words a minute, and I was to tell that to the man I rented the machine from. An operator would not be necessary because she knew how to work them all. I started toward the bedroom to fetch my Neiman Marcus rain cape, and my eye drifted willy-nilly toward the scroll over the desk. I did not look at it directly, but instead at a tempera on wood of a Baroque orange and chestnut newel post, a detail from backstairs at Blenheim Castle from Marion Davies's house, which she dismissed. A little decorator thing. I thought it would go with the chair, but now this is important. This is what you should see. And she took the scroll down from its hook. I was going to show you this, she said. Have the man... Here, the man can wait. I guess he's getting paid, isn't he? You get out your notebook and copy it down, and be sure you get the words right. The legend cut into copper read, "My son, Lee Harvey Oswald, even after his death, has done more for his country than any other living human being. Margaret C. Oswald." As I was writing down this abstruse manifesto, I could not get a purchase on the Syntax. Mrs. Oswald brought my things and smiled disarmingly. "Of course I'm not a writer like you," she said, "but I like how that sounds." That's what I said at the year period when I went to the grave. Newspaper reporters came by the galore and asked if I had anything to say. And I said this, and every word of it is true. I'm proud of my son, and why not? My son is an unsung hero. I remembered that she had petitioned to have Lee Harvey buried in Arlington Cemetery. I thanked her for giving me so much of her time, and I thanked her for the coffee. Her hand clasp was firm and straightforward, and her eyes shone with zeal and satisfaction and optimism. We're going to win in the end. I was not sure whether the we was editorial or whether I had now been initiated into a coterie whose adversaries were they. On the drive back, I browsed through some matter Mrs. Oswald had lent me. One was a paperback book by Carrie Thornley, who had known Lee Harvey in the Marines and had dedicated his iconoclastic critique on how America helped Oswald to become what he did, to Clint Bolton, who first said to me, "Go home and write, you bum." I did not get much further than that. The other was a pamphlet proving that it was ballistically impossible for Oswald to have killed Kennedy. This was a compilation of diagrams and of copies of letters that had been sent, accompanying the diagrams, to leading magazines and to people of position. The letters, significantly, had gone unanswered or had been brushed aside. A ferocious admonition in the beginning of the text prevents me from quoting any part of it. Soon after the assassination, my husband got a good many letters addressed to him in his role as critic of the press. Most of them told him how to go about his reporting, and most of them went into the waste paper basket. He was, as a matter of fact, at work on one of his wayward press analysis for the New Yorker just before he died. A little more than a month after the president was killed, he brought home for me to read one of the letters, whose author implored, "Mr. Liebling, go to Dallas and tell us the truth. You might, of course, get killed in Texas, but if you get killed, the world shall know that somebody from the right, be it Birchers or Southern Democrats, wants to hide the truth." Exegetes of the Dallas murders sprang up like mushrooms in a pine woods after a soaking rain. The mycelium at the round earth's four corners was rich and ready. Many of the toadstools that appeared were harmless, but without flavor. Some were tasty and even delicious. Many more were as noxious as the Amanita verna. In the cities in whose purlieus these mycologist wonderlands flourished, kangaroo courts met round the clock, and some of the judges and some of the jurors were responsible people, and the opinions they handed down were persuasive. They were shooting in the dark, but they managed to convince themselves and millions of others that their shots dispelled the darkness and everything was limpidly illuminated. Theory, creative and flexible, made mincemeat of circumstantial evidence. The name of the prisoner in the dock was Legion. He had every pigmentation and every shape of jaw known to anthropology. He was a member of every political organization, every religious fraternity, every business, scientific, criminal, occult conclaves of every country on the face of the earth. In some of these courtroom spectaculars, the remarks from the peanut gallery were deafening. The confusion was such that one could not remember which were the good guys and which the bad ones. Among Mark Lane, Perry Mason, Melvin Belly, and the Defenders man, let alone which belonged to the Bar Association, which to the American Federation of Radio and Television Artists. Lee Harvey Oswald was convicted of having pulled the trigger, but at the instigation of a highly organized and dangerous gang. In other reenactments of the drama, he was not even on the premises, but was under a haystack, fast asleep. In Europe, where there has never been an assassination of a political figure for an apolitical individual reason, the idea that Oswald, obscure, untutored, could have acted on his own was insupportable, and the most important papers of the most important capitals carried stories categorically proving conspiracy. As we entered Dallas and drove along the route of the president's caravan, I observed, as I had the other 2 times I had been over this same ground, that the distance between the 6th-floor window of the Texas Book Depository and the place where the car, slowing for a turn, had been, seemed to be much less than it had appeared in photographs. I was struck, moreover, by the fact that between the window and the target there was no obstruction of any kind to challenge aim or deflect the attention. No eave or overhang or tree. The drop shot from a steadied rifle was fired. On a day of surpassing clarity, the marksmanship of the gunner did not have to be remarkable. Oh my God, what the hell was that second to last page about? About mushrooms. What the fuck was she talking about? Anyway, that was long and tedious, but I made it through. All right, bruvs, that's all. Goodbye.